Welcome to this lecture on neural networks and deep learning. Today, we will dive into how neural networks function, why they are powerful, and how they connect both to biology and modern AI. By the end of this lecture, you should have a strong understanding of perceptrons, activation functions, optimization, backpropagation, and how to avoid pitfalls like overfitting. So, as a little refresher, remember from past lectures that artificial intelligence is the broad field, and that machine learning is a class of systems within AI. Furthermore, neural networks are but one family of methods within machine learning, and by extension, AI algorithms. Deep learning is simply the study and engineering of neural networks that have multiple hidden layers. Think of it as nesting dolls. Deep learning is a form of neural networks, which are themselves a form of machine learning, which is itself a form of artificial intelligence. The perceptron, or artificial neuron, is the fundamental computational unit of deep learning. The perceptron at its simplest has 5 key parts: inputs, weights, sum operation, nonlinear transformation, and outputs. The process is as follows. An artificial neuron takes multiple inputs, applies weights, sums them, adds a bias, which is itself a weighted unit input, then passes the result of these weights, sum of inputs, through a nonlinear activation function and uses that to produce an output. This can be represented with a mathematical expression on the right, considering the foundation of all neural networks. Inputs can be multidimensional. For example, in health data, you might have 5 features: age, blood pressure, glucose, cholesterol, BMI. Each input is weighted differently, summed, and transformed by the perceptron. The bias allows the neuron to shift its decision threshold, adding flexibility. Once we are dealing with a large number of inputs and weights, linear algebra can be used to simplify the notation. Instead of writing sums for each input, we use vectors and matrices for biases and linear combinations of inputs. In this case, you can notice that the transpose of the input vector is multiplied by the weight vector to produce the weighted sum of inputs, plus the bias vector to produce the full argument that will be fed to our activation function. This compact representation is what allows us to scale from a few inputs to millions, billions, or even more parameters. Activation functions introduce nonlinearity, which is essential in modern machine learning. Without this nonlinearity, stacked perceptrons would collapse into one linear function. Nonlinear activations let networks approximate any function, no matter how complex, as we will see later on through the universal function approximation theorem. The sigmoid is one classic choice of nonlinear activation function. The sigmoid squashes any input into a probability between 0 and 1. This is especially useful for binary classification, like predicting whether a skin lesion is malignant or benign, as well as many other global health problems. The hyperbolic tangent, or TNH, activation outputs values between -1 and 1. This symmetry around 0 is useful when both negative and positive responses matter, such as steering left or right in self-driving cars, or guiding a robotic surgery robot or another actuator in a clinical setting. The rectified linear unit, ReLU, is the workhorse of modern deep learning. It outputs 0 for negative inputs and the raw value for positive inputs. ReLU is computationally efficient and helps mitigate the vanishing gradient problem. Variants like the leaky ReLU prevent neurons from dying by allowing small negative values. The only strict requirement for any activation function is differentiability, so gradients can flow during backpropagation. On the left, we see a typical problem set up in medicine. 2 groups of points, green and orange, that are not linearly separable by a single straight line. A single perceptron with linear activation functions can only draw straight lines, linear decision boundaries. By combining multiple perceptrons and adding nonlinear activations, neural networks can approximate complex, curved boundaries, giving them the power to solve problems that are impossible for a single perceptron, like XOR or this cluster separation. Given that the nonlinear transformation of weighted inputs can be interpreted as a single processing step in the decision-making of our canonical model of an artificial neuron, we can collapse this linear algebra notation into a single state we will call Z, to further simplify our notation to allow for us to see what happens when we start combining neurons together. Now that we have discussed what a single perceptron or artificial neuron is, now we can talk about what a network of these objects produces. A neural network is simply multiple perceptrons stacked together, in its simplest form with a single layer, but where there could be multiple layers, as we will see in further sections. These layers between the input and output are called hidden layers. A dense layer is a kind of hidden layer where every neuron connects to all neurons in the next layer. Shallow networks have one hidden layer. Deep networks have 2 or more. The term deep is relative. Even 2 hidden layers may be called deep, though modern architectures often have dozens or even hundreds of hidden layers. Now, before we go any further, I want to stop for a second and appreciate first the key motivation for neural networks, which is biological inspiration. The brain, with billions of neurons demonstrates through a sort of proof by existence that intelligence and learning, and perhaps even consciousness, arises from biological neural networks. Early models of artificial neurons attempted to mimic our earlier understandings of how dendrites, inputs, soma, integration, and axons, outputs, were arranged and behaved. Modern neuroscience shows that real neurons are more complex than the ones that we use in artificial neural networks. Indeed, biological neurons are highly influenced by chemical signals, glial cells, and dynamic regulation. Biological neurons can have 1,000 to 200,000 synapses, depending on type. Biological synapses aren't just simple weights. They vary in strength, location, receptor type, and short and long-term plasticity. Neurotransmitters and neuromodulators, dopamine, serotonin, etc., change how signals are processed dynamically. Inputs in biological neurons are integrated in time, not just instantaneously, like we do now in artificial neurons, and signals decay and sum over milliseconds in biological systems. Furthermore, biological dendrites themselves are nonlinear processors, capable of local computations before signals even reach the soma. And finally, outputs in human brains appear to be event-based, spikes, rather than continuous values, which is how most artificial neural networks are modeled today. That said, there is an expansive body of research that is updating that and moving towards various methods of modeling deep learning systems, many of which are more inspired in nature, and others that in fact are less inspired by the particular way in which Earth's biology may have collapsed as a solution to the intelligence problem. Still, this abstraction provided the first bridge between biology and artificial intelligence. The second motivation for the explosive use of neural networks is mathematical. As it turns out, neural networks are universal function approximators. This means that a feed-forward neural network with a single hidden layer can approximate any arbitrary continuous function, of course, provided enough neurons. To understand intuitively how the synthetic proof I am showing here works, think about the general problem of approximating a curve in calculus by stacking rectangles. One can create such deltas with two shifted nonlinear step functions, which are of course implementable with perceptrons. With enough of such units, the approximation becomes arbitrarily better in its resolution and capacity to minimize error with the target function. Now, if this target function can be nth dimensional, in fact could represent a computer vision task, a text generation task, a complex reasoning task, or even a high-fidelity abstraction of a world model. This principle of general function approximation is precisely why neural networks have become ubiquitous in the way we approach artificial intelligence and why they are theoretically so powerful. All that said, in practice, approximating arbitrary functions to an arbitrary degree in the real world may often require an impractically large number of artificial neurons and computational resources. Still, the theoretical guarantee is profound. Artificial neural networks can approximate anything that can be described as a function or transformation of states, which is pretty much everything in the universe. Okay, so how do these systems actually learn? Well, imagine for a second that you have the task of differentiating skin cancer in a set of pigmented lesions, a very relevant global health task in addressing skin cancer mortality. In this case, you can imagine lesions scattered into two axes, one being a combination of A, B, C, D features, A for asymmetry, B for borders, C for colors, and D for diameter, along with a second axis based on the evolution or percent change of that lesion in some period of time. From this, you will find that there may be two distinct groups of lesions. So given a new lesion, you would like to train a classifier that is able to determine the class of that new sample. In order to find such a function, we can have to train such neural network to set its weights or knobs in an exquisitely tuned position to approximate such function. Remember that in this case the function looks trivially easy, but you may imagine how complicated that function is if instead of two numerical features, you input directly an image situation that we will see in much greater detail in later lectures. So this learning in neural networks requires an objective. The most common sensical definition of an objective for most neural networks is to minimize an error. That of course requires us to define what is an appropriate measure error in the context we want to use this system. This definition is abstracted, generally, through the concept of a loss function, which quantifies how far predictions are from true labels. Here there are two important terms in the jargon of machine learning that are often used interchangeably, but that are distinct. One is the so-called loss, which is the error measure for a single data point. The other is the term cost, which refers to the error measure for the entire dataset, or a batch. Often the average, or sum, of the individual losses. Thus, the cost function aggregates losses across the dataset. Think of it as the network's report card, summarizing its performance over all training examples. In our dermatology example, our model could be generating a confidence number between 0 and 1, which can be understood as a probability with the actual class being binary. The loss could be the difference between the predicted value and the target class. But it could be defined differently as well. In fact, different problems require different loss function definition. For regression, mean squared error or mean absolute error are very useful. For classification problems, cross-entropy loss is very common, as it measures the distance between predicted and true probability distributions and can be adapted to both binary and multi-class classification tasks. Therefore, predicting melanoma versus benign lesions is a binary classification problem. Cross-entropy is ideal here, since it compares predicted probabilities to true labels and penalizes confident wrong predictions heavily. And something very important to recognize is that different loss definitions will provide different properties that may affect the process of optimization, as some of these loss functions may transition smoothly or more abruptly in different value regions, for example close to zero or far from it, or in negative values versus positive. This is important because the loss is the signal that our optimization logic will utilize to drive learning, and if that is not bounded or thought out appropriately for the expected set of errors as we improve performance, it could lead to non-convergence and therefore absence of learning. As we have mentioned before, when using perceptrons in neural networks, the process of training can be thought as adjusting weights or knobs in each of these neurons, so that altogether minimize a loss per sample, but more generally the cost in all the training dataset, with the verification of such generalization to the test set. The most relevant optimization tool that allows us to search for such combination of weights is the process of gradient descent, where we attempt to compute the slope of the loss function with respect to each weight, then update weights in the opposite direction iteratively over many cycles of seeing the data, or so-called epochs. Think of it as descending a mountain valley. The gradient is this slope that you and your feet can feel, which points uphill in the standard definition of a gradient, so we step downhill to reduce error. This landscape of weights is often referred as a surface, or manifold. By following the negative of the gradient in an algorithmic loop, one can iteratively guide our neural network toward better performance in its prediction task. Alright, so how do we actually compute gradients across layers of a deep neural network? With backpropagation, which is essentially the process of applying the chain rule of calculus from cost value to model weight selection in the context of an input. Since there are discrete computation steps, what we do is that we propagate errors backward, updating each weight according to its contribution to the final loss, using the differentiable chain rule definition you see here. As simple as it may look now, the concept of backpropagation was a real breakthrough that made deep learning feasible, allowing for multi-layer networks to be trained efficiently, something previously thought impractical or at times intractable or impossible with the limitations of most physical hardware. Now, something very important to appreciate is that the higher number of weights or parameters our deep neural networks have, the more precisely they can approximate various systems and solutions, but also the more complex their weight combination landscape or parameter manifold will be. Here you can see three relatively small networks, for today's standards, trained on the same data, but with increasing number of model parameters from left to right. The model on the left is the least expressive and capable of learning, but it's the easiest to learn to its absolute minima in parameter space, while the model on the right is the most expressive and capable of learning information, but is the most difficult of these three to learn an absolute error minimization parameter combination. Hyperparameters are conditions or values that define how we constrain the process of model training. One key hyperparameter in deep neural networks is the learning rate, which is defined as a scalar that multiplies the gradient that optimizes the current model weights in every training iteration, often with a degree of randomness that help the algorithm find novel places to explore, which provides the full name of this process, stochastic gradient descent. Thus, the learning rate determines the step size in gradient descent, or as you remember in this process of you walking a valley. Too high, and the network jumps around without converging. Too low, and training becomes painfully slow. Here you can see how in a projected network weight landscape, the selection of the inappropriate learning rate can dramatically affect the capacity of a system to find the point in the landscape of model weights that will best minimize the error across all samples. Optimizers improve gradient descent. Algorithms like ADAM, RMSProp, and SGD with momentum adapt learning rates dynamically, helping networks converge faster and more reliably. Training proceeds in epochs, full passes over the dataset. Within each epoch, data can be divided into mini-batches, allowing efficient parallel computation on GPUs. Batching balances efficiency and accuracy. Small batches provide noisy but frequent updates. Large batches are more stable but computationally expensive. Common sizes are 32, 64, or 128. GPUs revolutionized deep learning because matrix multiplications for batches can be computed in parallel. This is why large neural networks became practical only in the last decade. Here, a summary of the stochastic gradient descent algorithm. First, you initialize your model weights. They can start with some random values or with a set of pre-computed values result of a previous training process in different or related data, a process called transfer learning. Then you iterate for n epochs, evaluating the loss in a batch of samples, then compute the gradients that better approximate the desired output. And then, based on the learning rate, you update the weights. You then do this for dozens, hundreds, thousands of iterations in hundreds, thousands, millions of samples to optimize the hundreds, thousands, millions, or billions of parameters of your deep neural network at hand. This hopefully illustrates how this process would be humanly impossible to undertake, and why it is so outstanding in terms of engineering prowess to have achieved such engineering complexity with such simple algorithmic logics. Finally, at some point, the model performance hopefully converges within a reasonable training time to define a final set of weights, or your SO, called model definition, in the context of the defined network architecture used. A key challenge in all this process is to maximize learning while preventing overfitting, which is when a model memorizes training data instead of learning generalizable patterns. This happens because neural networks are so flexible and good at learning patterns from data. In overfitting, training loss decreases while validation loss increases. The model performs well on seen data, but poorly on unseen data. This is a red flag. Monitoring training involves tracking training loss and validation loss curves over epochs. The optimal stopping point is where validation loss is lowest before it begins to rise. Think of each epoch as producing a new model. The best model is not necessarily the one at the final epoch, but the one that generalizes best to unseen data. To prevent overfitting, there are many techniques, such as regularization, which include L1/L2 penalties. But there are other things like implementing a neuronal dropout, as well as early stopping when validation loss starts to rise. Dropout is particularly powerful in preventing overfitting. By randomly silencing neurons during training, the network is forced to distribute learning across multiple pathways, improving generalization. Regularization ensures models do not become unnecessarily complex. The simplest model that explains the data well is usually the best choice. Echoing Occam's razor. Biological brains also use redundancy and noise to avoid overfitting. Dropout is inspired by this. By reducing reliance on specific neurons, networks become more robust. Great, so we have completed learning the fundamentals of deep neural networks. However, the journey of mastering them is far from complete. There is indeed a zoo of possible architectures to explore, from convolutional neural networks for images, recurrent networks and transformers for sequences, and graph neural networks for structured data. Each architecture type is optimized for a specific type of data. CNNs excel in image recognition, RNNs and transformers dominate natural language, and GNNs handle relational data like molecules or social networks, and new architectures get created almost every day. Deep learning is powerful because it builds complex functionality from simple units. Its versatility comes from reusing the same core building blocks in different architectures, along with newly enabled capacity for sequential and parallel computing that makes their optimization possible. In this course, you will experiment with these architectures in labs. You will also see practical applications in global health with real datasets we provide, such as some for anemia detection, cancer screening, medical imaging, and genomics. So that concludes our session on neural networks and deep learning fundamentals for global health. If you stuck around, I hope you agree it was an exciting and profound journey. We learned that neural networks are universal approximators built from perceptrons, powered by gradient descent and back propagation, and improved by careful use of loss functions, optimizers, and regularization. Their potential is in all aspects of human activity, are vast, and we are just scratching the surface of what they can help us do in medicine, global health, and beyond.